Hey, welcome. Today we're going to get into a fascinating, kind of counterintuitive idea about power. We're going to break down the mechanics of what's called tacit dominance and explore why, in a world that just won't stop talking, real control often belongs to the person who says the least. So let's just kick things off with a question. In our hyper-connected, always-on world, where everyone's shouting for attention, who's really running the show? Is it the loudest person in the room? The most charismatic one?
Believe it or not, the answer is often the person who says the least. It seems backwards, right? But it's an incredibly powerful concept. In this explainer, we're going to unpack the science and the strategy behind why being quiet, strategically, is one of the best tools for influence you can have.
Okay, so first up, let's talk about what we call the power paradox. We're basically living in a culture that seems to reward being talkative, but the real levers of influence are often pulled with restraint. If you look back, there's been this huge cultural shift. We used to have a culture of character, where things like discipline and integrity were the gold standard. But then we moved into a culture of personality, where being charming and a good self-promoter became everything. And that's where this powerful, but often totally false idea came from, that talking more means you're more competent. So you might be thinking, is being quiet just a personality trait? Well, not really. The ability to stay silent, especially under pressure, is actually hardwired into our neurobiology. Let's take a look at what's happening inside the quiet brain. A lot of it comes down to something called prefrontal cortex asymmetry. Now, that sounds super complicated, but just think of your prefrontal cortex as your brain's CEO. If your left lobe is more active, you tend to have more restraint. But if the right lobe is the one running the show, well, you're more likely to have lower impulse control, which makes you talk more freely, and sometimes a little too much. And this really creates a whole spectrum. On one end, with that left lobe dominance, you've got super high restraint. In the middle, you've got a balanced brain, which is great for a thoughtful give and take. But as that right lobe activity starts to ramp up, you see that ability to hold back just fade, all the way to what some people call talkaholism, where there's almost no verbal filter left. And of course, the brain's reward system, dopamine, plays a huge role here. Talkative people often get that little dopamine hit from external stuff, like getting attention or social approval. But for quieter folks, that reward comes from the inside, from thinking, processing, and planning. This is what creates that perception of quiet confidence, right? They don't need you to tell them they're smart to feel satisfied. Okay, now let's get into the psychological mechanics. This is where silence stops being this passive thing and becomes an active, incredibly powerful tool in pretty much any conversation. It's called the silence effect. It's that thing that happens when someone intentionally pauses. It creates this kind of psychological vacuum, and it's a vacuum the other person feels an almost biological pressure to fill, and they often do it by giving up way more information than they ever planned to. So why is this so incredibly effective right now? Because our attention spans are shot. A study back in 2015 found the average human attention span has dropped to just 8 seconds. Yeah, that's statistically less than a goldfish. In an environment like that, overtalking isn't cutting through. It's just creating more noise. Let's break it down like this. A high volume of words just leads to cognitive overload for the listener, and it waters down your own message. But a strategic pause? It does the exact opposite. It actually helps the other person remember what you said, and it signals authority. You're respecting their brain's limits, which makes your words land with way more impact. Okay, so we've covered the why. Now, how do we actually apply this? Let's dig into some specific strategies that turn simple listening into a form of control.
This framework actually comes from a pretty intense source, former FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss. He calls it tactical empathy, and it's built on a really simple principle. The person who is listening the hardest in the room is the one who's truly in control. They're gathering all the intelligence while giving almost nothing away. So how does it actually work? Well, it boils down to 3 core skills. First is mirroring. You just repeat the last 1 to 3 critical words someone says. It's amazing how well this works. Second, labeling. You name the emotion you're hearing. Something like, it seems like you're concerned about this. And finally, summarizing. You restate their position so well that they just have to say, that's right. When you get that that's right, you know you've built trust. And this right here is the master tool, the calibrated question. It's an open-ended question designed to avoid a yes or no answer. Instead, it invites them to work with you, but on your terms. Asking, how am I supposed to do that, is genius. It subtly makes them see the problem from your side and gets them to help you solve it.
All right, let's pull all these ideas together now and see how they really work in high-stakes professional environments, because this is where strategic silence goes from a neat trick to an absolute superpower. Look, high performers aren't quiet because they're afraid to speak up. They're quiet because they're being strategic. Before they say anything, they're running a quick mental checklist. Is this relevant right now? Am I actually ready with the data to back this up? And maybe most importantly, is the person I'm talking to even ready to hear this? By waiting for just the right moment, they make sure that when they do speak, people listen.
Don't be a sponge, just passively soaking up whatever comes your way. Be a trampoline. Amplify and reflect the ideas of others to gather more intelligence, all while you protect your own position by saying less.
And that leaves us with a final challenge. The next time you're in a meeting, a negotiation, or even just a casual chat, try it. Deploy a strategic pause. What might you discover about the whole dynamic by just saying nothing at all? Thanks for joining this explainer.